I'm Swapnil Bharti, and we are here in Vancouver, Canada, to cover OpenStack Summit. And today we have with us Bryan from Rackspace. It's great meeting you again and again and again. But the interesting thing is that every time we meet, the market changes, it moves forward. So tell us what has happened in the last 6 months.
I mean, obviously, open source and OpenStack has been a big part for Rackspace, a big component of our business as a whole, and our involvement in this community. But to your point, even with each summit, the landscape continues to change and kind of what becomes really topical and what people are really interested in. I was joking with somebody the other night where there are some components of OpenStack that have become boring. It almost seems like it's not as maybe breaking news, and I think it's really just because those core projects have matured, but now you're seeing a lot more of the what are adjacent or augmenting technologies, Kubernetes and containers. I know we had talked about in the past, and you've seen that more prominently featured as key areas of focus and technologies that customers are consuming or running on top of these.
But boring is good, right? Boring means things are stabilized, things are not, still in that phase. So, if you look at Kubernetes community, they keep saying that we are boring, so we want it to become boring, so that focus can shift to someone else. So, from your perspective, do you think it's a bad thing or a good thing?
Oh, I think it's a great thing. Mm-hmm. I think it shows again those core components have matured to where it's no longer a science experiment.
Right.
It's assumed that that substrate of infrastructure as a service now works.
Right.
The technology is very solid. There's no shortage of examples of people running it and being successful consuming OpenStack. So I think becoming boring is actually a really good sign of maturity of the technology and the ecosystem around it.
Right. But at the same time, when things are become boring, but you do have to keep excitement around or on top of that. How you are keeping up with all these changes, number one. Number two is, what is your strategy towards Kubernetes? And number three is, how do you bring value to your customers?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's great, and it actually very much aligns with kind of our mission and where we've been going. The conversation that we have with our customers has changed from being specific about OpenStack. It's really about private cloud as a service. So with our customers, it's even, I think it goes back to where the technology is maturing. It's not about which version are you on and which projects are you supporting and what is the kind of speeds and feeds feature set component. It's now much more about business outcomes. So we've been working with customers really around the overall unit economics of where does it make sense for workloads to be placed in public cloud or private cloud? With private cloud, what are those new technologies that I can start to consume on top of that? And thus containers, again, and Kubernetes in particular, has been this real emerging use case that we've seen in the OpenStack user surveys. And we've seen that certainly come to fruition in our own business and where customers are looking to do that. So from the Rackspace side, our value proposition and the value that we've been bringing customers is, how do I consume these technologies and operate them at scale? How do I consume it as a service? So with OpenStack, it's always been around that operator persona. How are we delivering the challenges of day two operations? It's not just installing or running OpenStack, it's how do I run it at scale and go through upgrades and expansion and capacity planning and patching and managing these platforms. Now it's extending up on top of that as well as we look at the consumption of containers. Kubernetes is amazing. How do I actually consume a Kubernetes cluster and all of the sidecar component services that I really need to get value out of this and make it effective for my developers and application owners to really start to use this technology? And so that's where our focus has been, certainly around our private cloud business, delivering these platforms and operating them for customers where they are rock solid, stable infrastructure as a service, and now helping them move up and embrace and consume these newer technologies, right? Moving to containers, embracing Kubernetes, and really starting to move to those containerized workloads and application deployment on top of that.
So what kind of Kubernetes-related offerings do you have?
Sure. We just last week announced publicly our Containers as a Service solution, which is a managed service deploying and fully managing and operating Kubernetes clusters on top of an IaaS infrastructure. So we can deliver this as a fully managed service for our customers, which includes not just the Kubernetes cluster, deploying, maintaining, monitoring, managing those platforms, but also, again, many of those component sidecar services, to use that same vernacular, that are really needed to consume it. Prometheus and a number of the other services that you really need as part of a complete stack and solution to really take on the technologies and consume it in an effective way for an enterprise. By delivering it as a managed service, we take away all that complexity of operating it and maintaining and managing that, and can deliver that whether we're hosting it in a private cloud or deploying it on a customer data center or third-party data center. So it's really their private cloud wherever they need it to be.
Right. So why would somebody choose rack-based Kubernetes solution versus so many other things are out there?
Yeah, sure. It's the solution that we're providing is really bringing our expertise, that opinionated deployment, where we're pulling these services together. It is not a forked or proprietary distribution. So if you think about many organizations that are looking to embrace this technology, they're also at the same time trying to avoid going down a vendor lock-in type of path.
Yep.
Our approach, and again, we're a services company. We're delivering that fanatical support and operations experience around these technologies. So we're not looking to create a proprietary distribution or branch or fork in some way. It's really about how are we helping them with the complexity and day two operations that are the challenges and barriers to adoption in many cases.
So is it fully upstream Kubernetes offering? And so how do you integrate with the rest of the rack-based offerings?
Yeah, it's delivering this today. We deliver this as a form factor on top of an OpenStack platform. So we leverage a lot of those same fabric services and components that you need from the IaaS infrastructure, but we're using the native upstream source code, right, pulling from stable branch and deploying it in an opinionated fashion. So how we know we can deploy, scale, and operate these clusters, how do we monitor them, how do we bring in those adjacent or augmenting services to deliver kind of a full capability to that platform.
When we look at edge computing, it just changes the game altogether because so much decisions are being made at the edge,
Yeah.
Sometimes if you look at Amazon Go, there's a store where, you just walk into the store and buy stuff.
Yeah.
So a lot of decisions are being made, but you cannot move data center locally.
Right.
So what new challenges does that kind of, as the market is evolving, create for the OpenStack community? And that was a white paper, but realistically, when you deal with customers, what real problem do you see?
Yeah, I mean, some of the emerging use cases, at least where we've been having conversations with customers around edge computing, and I think to the Foundation's credit, defining what edge computing means has kind of varied too, so kind of agreeing around that lexicon and what are you really looking to solve. But some of the immediate use cases that we're starting to help customers start to think about how we would solve is applications in manufacturing, where you have legacy is the wrong phrase, but I have all kinds of telemetry data and safety data coming, PCL level data coming out of different manufacturing environments. But these are, for all intended purpose, air-gapped facilities, right? They're not connected to the internet. You're not going to have a cloud service that's going to communicate to these or potentially affect or disrupt that. So how do you provide localized edge cloud computing devices that can be used for IoT-style data collection and then manage that data, decision, provide reporting and analytics. Similar use cases in healthcare.
Right.
We've been talking with a customer about how do I start to deploy thousands of clouds across every hospital as an example, and how do I start to collect data from the different MRIs and other large devices that they have in place there to start to collect and provide this data, but you have all kinds of HIPAA compliance and other components that you need to make sure that you're accounting for and how you can use these technologies to do so. So it's a fascinating space. I think the number of use cases, because the technology has become so stable, if you will, that now you're starting to see all these new use cases emerge. I think we talked a little bit about NFV and 5G and where that starts to really change the game as well, right? How am I actually putting compute resources in cell towers that I can do local decisioning and manage a instance of an application following you from tower to tower, and the complexity that goes with that. But it's amazing to think of what you can start to solve now with this technology.
Since we were talking about new use cases, I met Dr. Ellie Grant from Boston Children's Hospital at Red Hat Summit, and they're using a lot of these OpenStack and OpenShift and all those technologies, but machine learning is becoming a very critical use case. Now, in her case, they have the data set, cancerous cells or whatever, they have to look at, and they can get help from machine learning. Yesterday, I interviewed Tim Bell from CERN, and he said, that we do want to use machine learning, but we don't know what to look at because, we don't have a model to
Particle
see
physics.
We don't know what Higgs boson or, what they all look like. So these are two distinct use cases for machine learning when you use OpenStack, So where is machine learning in the OpenStack,
Yeah, I think it's emerging themes. AI and machine learning are definitely key themes. from my experience and with customers, I think we might be still kind of moving into that space. There's interest towards that and start to think about applications and workloads and how will that have an impact on these types of services that I'm consuming. But I think it's still very early stage in many cases.
Yeah, but you mentioned edge, and I think machine learning can play a...
They're very tightly coupled, right? If you
exactly.
think about
if you think about your IoT, oil companies, they use deep machine learning to know, through sensors. Otherwise, sensor is collecting data; it's useless.
Sure. No, that's exactly right. How do I start to do real-time analytics and analysis of this stuff? Yeah, it's again for us, and we're early on in this journey working with the customers towards this. But you definitely see the potential and applications of it. It's now, how do we stitch this together to make it effective?
Okay, now I'll talk about something that I talk to you almost every time, and that is people keep telling me that OpenStack is dead. The thing is, they want the hype cycle, and when the hype cycle settles down, the honeymoon period is over, it's time to feed the family and kids, then they say, oh, it's bad. So what do you have to say about that? First of all, it's good that hype cycle is over, so at least you can get back to the real world.
The trough of disillusionment, but now you're seeing the just kind of mainstream adoption. I think it's to be expected, certainly from a clickbait of is OpenStack dead? You could argue there's a number of metrics saying, there's a number of companies that have diversified or disengaged from it. I think it's actually more you're seeing just the ecosystem maturing. So there are the adoption patterns of how people are being successful in consuming the technology, and those are the ones that have started to really stabilize and kind of continue to grow. I know in our own business, it continues to grow and is a key part of our growth. So we know OpenStack's not dead. It's actually adoption at scale, I think, is increasing. It goes back to, is OpenStack boring now? It's gone from test dev, POC to now mainstream adoption and starting to really spread a lot in that context. But it may be, again, where it's assumed now. This IaaS substrate is very rock solid. Now let's go to the next buzzword and next emerging technology around it.
I think we talked about some broad topics. Is there anything else you would like to wrap up with? Or
that's kind of the biggest for us, right, is we continue to see growth and adoption of OpenStack. It's not dead. Maybe aspects of it are boring, but that's a good thing. And then, of course, from an excitement from our side, we're starting to see more of that adoption and the acceleration of adoption of Kubernetes, and where customers are working with us, looking for that expertise and helping them be successful consuming these complex technologies. That's been exciting for us.
Awesome. Thank you so much for talking to me again today. We'll look forward to meeting you again.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Bye.